Good afternoon and welcome back to the second panel of today. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome the speakers of the second panel. Let's start with our first presenter, Caila Jackson. Caila Jackson is a junior research fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and Wolfson College, University of Oxford. Her work focuses on the medieval arts of the book of the Central and Eastern Islamic lands. She's the author of the prize-winning monograph, Islamic Manuscripts of Late Medieval Rome, 1270s to 1370s, Production, Patronage, and the Arts of the Book, published by the Edinburgh University Press in 2020. She has also published several articles concerning late medieval manuscript production in Anatolia and Persia. She's going to illuminate us with her paper, Illumination in Late Medieval Baghdad, the forerunner of the Baysunghuri Arts of the Book. Caila, floor is yours.
Thank you, Shiva, and thank you for that amazing pun as well. I'm just going to try and share my screen. But thank you again for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to take part in the inaugural conference of the PMA. My topic today, Illumination in Late Medieval Baghdad, is very much a work in progress. I'm quite new to the study of Baysunghur. As Shiva said, my origins lie in Anatolia, so please forgive me if I drop any clangers today. Okay, it's a bit of a delay. So the connection between the Baysunghuri look of the book and Shiraz Manuscripts has been acknowledged by many historians of Islamic art, most recently by our illustrious chair, Shiva Mihan, in her PhD thesis, Timurid Manuscript Production, the Scholarship and Aesthetics of Prince Baysunghur's Royal Atelier. As you can see, the visual similarities between these two examples are indeed undeniable. At the end of this paper, I will come back to Baysunghur and the development of Shiraz illumination into the Baysunghuri aesthetic. However, the main focus of this paper is on Shiraz illumination, how it developed and what its main characteristics were. The point of this being to build upon what we already know about the arts of the book in the later medieval period, and to advance the study of Shiraz illumination, which at present needs further elaboration. This is in part because there are numerous manuscripts from this period that remain unattributed or are identified on somewhat shaky grounds. So hopefully a better understanding of Shiraz illumination will help us to improve and consolidate our knowledge of the manuscript record at this time. Before I look at the material, I just want to clarify some historical points. I'm sure some of you know this context really well, but for those of you who don't, I just want to briefly explain why I focused on Baghdad in the title of this paper. The Shirazids are often mentioned as rulers of Tabriz and Baghdad, and many publications assume, or at least they don't really question the fact that the Shirazids were in control of Tabriz in the late 14th century, which is not really the case if you look in a bit more detail. Following the collapse of Ilkhanid rule in 1335, the Shirazids successfully staked a claim to Baghdad quite quickly in 1339, and the city remained a crucial power base for them for the rest of the 14th and early 15th centuries. As Patrick Wing has clearly laid out in his monograph concerning Shiraz political history, the Shirazids attempted to take Tabriz several times in the 1330s and 1350s, finally succeeding in 1360 under the command of Sheikh Uwais. Shiraz rule over Tabriz was marked by conflict, disease, and natural disasters. In around 1365, Kavus Shirvani invaded twice and displaced much of Tabriz's population. In 1369, plague kills around 300,000 people in the city, while floods the year after destroy many buildings. In 1374, Uwais's son, Sultan Hussein, ascends the throne. The next year, Tabriz is again invaded, this time by Shah Shuja of the Muzaffarids, who then proceeds to abandon the city in 1376. So as if Sultan Hussein didn't have enough problems, in 1382, his brother, Sultan Ahmed, takes power in a coup and murders him. 3 to 4 years later, Sultan Ahmed loses Tabriz permanently to Timur and flees to Baghdad. Although many visually impressive manuscripts were produced in Baghdad for Sultan Ahmed, his rule over the city was similarly beset by disaster, often at the hands of Timur, who besieged the city in 1393 and 1401. In 1403, Kara Yusuf of the Karakoyunlu briefly occupied Baghdad, precipitating a process by which Sultan Ahmed's rather tenuous grip on his realm was slowly loosened until he was finally executed in 1410 by the Karakoyunlu leader. Around 13 years after Sheikh Uwais finally took control of Tabriz in 1360, he commissioned an illuminated copy of Al-Tuhfat al-Najibiyya, an Arabic text concerning the Islamic sciences. This on the left, can you see my cursor? Yes, this on the left here is the only decorated page. And it is so far the only illuminated manuscript securely identified as a product of Tabriz during Jalayirid rule. There's also this tiny circular Quran, as you can see in the middle, but I haven't been able to check whether it actually has any decoration. There must have been other decorated manuscripts produced in Tabriz in this period, given the city's status as a manuscript production center in the early and mid 14th century. In the decades just before Sheikh Uwais took over Tabriz, this frontispiece on the right was produced. It's from a now lost or unidentified manuscript produced for the Chopanid ruler Malik Ashraf, probably in Tabriz sometime during his reign, which dates 1343 to 1357. So that's what we have from Tabriz. So much of what is known about Jalayirid illumination centers around the magnificent early 15th century copy of the Divan, authored by and produced for Sultan Ahmed Jalayir. It's easy to understand why it attracts so much attention. The manuscript is extensively and expertly decorated, which with each of its 4 chapters preceded by shape, which is formed from a circle with 2 attached pendants. This is followed by a double frontispiece and double illuminated text pages. The illumination is rather colorful, with deep blue, deep red, bright orange, pale pink, mint green, black and white used alongside gold, of course. The manuscript was completed in Baghdad in 1407 during a very brief period of relative stability, if you can call it that, for Sultan Ahmed. He had returned to the city in 1405 after hearing that Timur had died, and left the city 4 years later in 1409 in an attempt to regain Sultaniya from the Karakoyunlu. He soon returned to Baghdad to quell a rebellion, only to be executed several months later by Kara Yusuf. The Divan represents probably the best of surviving Jalayirid illumination. And as you have very briefly seen, and as I'll discuss later, it certainly had a direct impact on illumination under Prince Baysunghur. However, the question remains of how we arrive at this point. Obviously, the Divan didn't emerge out of nowhere. Indeed, as discussed by scholars such as Filiz Charman, Zeren Tanende, and Nuran Ben Azuna, there are other earlier examples of Jalarid illumination that help us to better understand the developments from the Ilkhanid period through to the Timurid manuscripts of the early 15th century. After the fall of the Ilkhanids in 1335, various Mongol successors sought to gain control over their territories. As I mentioned, the Jalarids took Baghdad relatively quickly in 1339, while Tabriz was mainly under the control of the Chupanids, while the Injuids strengthened their hold on Shiraz. So obviously I have to simplify for the sake of time, but generally speaking, in the couple of decades following the fall of the Ilkhanids, illumination produced across Iraq and Iran broadly followed Ilkhanid styles, which is really not that surprising, given that manuscripts would have been produced by the same artists who worked for the Ilkhanids, and obviously a change in dynasty does not necessitate a change in aesthetics. So for instance, in these three examples from the 1340s and 1350s, you can see several elements that were also common in Ilkhanid illumination. So for example, here gold strap work containing colored squares. You have whole palmettes and split palmettes, lotuses, where I've lost my lotuses, they're there somewhere. Polylobed medallions here on the right, oh, there's the lotuses. Polylobed medallions and colorful petals here at the top, often called munhane in Turkish scholarship. It's difficult to be precise about the development of styles in specific cities due to significant gaps in the manuscript record, and because many manuscripts do not mention where they were produced. For example, the well-known calligrapher Arghun al-Kamili, who copied this manuscript on the left, and many others from the 1320s through to the 1350s, is widely thought to have been based in Baghdad. But according to Nuran Ben Azuna, this attribution is apparently only on the basis that he used the epithet al-Baghdadi a few times. In any case, some regional variation did start to emerge in the 1340s and 1350s. In this Malik Ashraf frontispiece in the center, for example, behind the slender, angular, ornamented script, we can see a very delicate sea green colored scroll work. And this would become very characteristic of Jalarid illumination. And in the Injuid Shahnama on frontispiece on the right, around the central polylobed medallion, it's a little bit difficult to see, but you might be able to make out some very delicate flowers and leaves here that would become smaller and smaller and smaller over the following decades in Muzaffarid manuscripts. So as you can see, the miniaturization of these flowers in Shirazi manuscripts start to become more pronounced in the 1350s. As you can see on the bottom right, this manuscript from 1361, the floral sprays are really very, very tiny. So by the early 1360s, the visual difference between the illumination of Eastern and Western Greater Persia had become more pronounced. In contrast to the distinctive minute gold floral sprays and blue and black palettes of Shiraz and surrounding area, Western Persia broadly retained the simpler geometry and use of split palmettes and scroll work that was more common under the Ilkhanids. It's rather challenging to reconstruct the chronological development of Jalarid illumination from Baghdad because relatively few dated and securely identified manuscripts remain. with many perhaps being destroyed by Timur when he flattened the city in the late 14th century. This slide shows most, not all, but most of what we have from Baghdad in the second half of the 14th century, just before the spectacular Divan of Sultan Ahmed was produced in 1407. There are many other manuscripts that are attributed to this context, but I just want to try and focus on examples that are more firmly identifiable as of Baghdadi origin, or certainly Jalarid at the very least. So obviously there are a lot of images on this slide, so I'll unpack this a little bit and focus on a couple of specific examples. Okay, so looking at one example of, on the left, we have Elgin Illumination. And then two from the Jalarid context in the middle and on the right, sorry. We can see that relatively simple, albeit varied shapes, are used throughout the century. The way that the page is divided or formatted, I think stays relatively straightforward, largely, using circles, squares, rectangles, that sort of thing. Although we do see an increased emphasis on some shapes that are less common in Elgin Illumination, such as these cloud collar-ended cartouches. Within these cartouches, we often see this very thin, ornamental style of angular script used usually, but not always, written in white pigment over delicate circular scrollwork. Angular scripts are used in Elgin headpieces and surah headings, but generally speaking, thuluth seems to be preferred. Sorry, one second. Right, yes. So as in Elgin manuscripts, Jalarid Illumination retains the use of these multiple borders of varying thickness. The use of thick gold strap work, for example, continues right throughout the 14th century. But one element that is not really that prominent in Elgin Illumination is the use of colorful floral borders, thin floral borders, as well as the increasingly wide outermost border that starts to become very, very dense, including complex interlaced half palmettes, split palmettes, and scrollwork. And this is a very broad point, but Elgin Illumination can be relatively colorful with a wide range of pigments used, but, and I think I need to find a bit more to support this, but I think I would argue that Jalarid Illumination seems to prioritize color to a larger extent, and uses less gold, I think, than Elgin manuscripts, instead foregrounding colors like blue, green, and red. This might have been because it was cheaper to use less gold, or perhaps because of an aesthetic preference or a combination of the two. So many of the elements that I've mentioned do appear in the 1407 Divan of Sultan Ahmed. These include cloud collar cartouches, thin angular scripts over scrollwork, floral inner borders, and wide elaborate outer borders. This manuscript is also distinctive for its extremely dense full page illuminations. These full page decorations do use geometric shapes like circles, but they combine these with non-geometric shapes like cloud collars and OG forms, which then are in turn merged with intricate curvilinear scrollwork and half and split palmettes. This rather heady effect is further enhanced by the copious use of gold, more so than in previous Jalarid manuscripts, as well as other colors like deep blue, mint green, and red. So I haven't been able to look more deeply into how exactly we arrive at these rather intense full page decorations. there are, of course, many illuminated manuscripts from the second half of the 14th century, particularly from Mamluk lands, that might provide further insights into how Jalayirid illumination developed. As Doris Behrens Abu Saif has noted in relation to metalwork, political connections between important Mamluk and Jalayirid political figures may have provided an avenue by which portable arts moved between these territories. She also points out that Mamluk Persian connections under the Ilkhanids also occurred. A well-known example of this is the illuminator, Ibrahim al-Ahmadi, moving from Persia to Cairo in the late 14th century, and then producing several heavily decorated Qurans for Mamluk sultans. So one element of illumination that is very prominent in that's very prominent in the Divan, and one I'd like to discuss further is the pointed circle. 4 of these illuminated shapes precede each of the 4 chapters in the Divan, but their appearance in that manuscript is not the earliest dated occurrence of the shape in an Islamic context. And the Mamluk connection I just mentioned, I think bears further discussion. Due to the pointed circle's prominence in Sultan Ahmed's Divan, I had previously just assumed that it was very much a Persianate kind of shape, but it looks like it possibly originated in the Mamluk realm. Again, I need to look at this in more depth, but there are earlier, slightly different versions of the shape that appear on Mamluk leather bindings and carved in marble. We also have an inscribed pointed circle that appears in a Quran with a date of 1358 to 59, and the partial name of a sultan, probably Al-Nasir Hassan, who ruled from 1347 to 1361. So we also see this shape in several early manuscripts copied by Ja'far al-Tabrizi, who in these earlier examples on the left did not yet use the nisba of al-Baysunghuri. However, the pointed circle also appears in manuscripts copied when Ja'far was definitely in the service of Baysunghur, which I believe was from at least 1421. Shiva can correct me if I'm wrong. And the pointed circle continues to persist in Persian manuscripts, popping up several times throughout the 15th and 16th centuries in manuscripts from Persia, as well as the Ottoman Empire, who of course absorbed many artists from Timurid and Akuyunlu lands. So the reason for the focus on Ja'far, who was primarily a calligrapher, not an illuminator, is because of the possible role he played in the perpetuation of the Jalayirid Baghdadi aesthetic in Baysunghuri illumination. As Shiva and others like Elaine Wright have discussed, manuscripts decorated in the blue and black floral styles of Shiraz were certainly available to Baysunghur, but seemingly had very little impact on the visual character of his patronage. Wright contends that Baysunghur might have preferred the Jalayirid style due to its associations with a culturally sophisticated court milieu in comparison to the more minor princely courts of Shiraz. Shiva Mihan takes this one step further, arguing that Ja'far's role as the head of Baysunghur's workshop and his links to artists formerly of the Jalayirid court would also have shaped the look of the Baysunghuri book. 1 second. What's happening? Okay. We don't have any inscriptions. I believe we don't have inscriptions that prove that Ja'far worked for the Jalayirids in Baghdad, but several later sources do know that he was a student of calligraphers who definitely worked for the Jalayirids, such as Ubaydullah, son of Mir Ali Tabrizi. So at this stage, we cannot know exactly why Baysunghur or Jafar may have preferred Julayrid illumination, whether it was for political, cultural, or aesthetic reasons, or indeed some combination of the three. However, we can say that developments in manuscript decoration in late medieval Baghdad continue to resonate throughout the 15th and even 16th centuries. Therefore, looking more precisely at the relationships between Elgin, Julayrid, Timurid, and Mamluk illumination can only contribute to a better understanding of the arts of the book in this complex and dynamic period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caila. That was fascinating as always. And thank you so much for being with us, although you're not feeling really well. And that was a really great detailed analysis of illuminations. We save the questions for later.